Hello and welcome to DayOne, a podcast by and for Cape Town to help better understand and guide the ways water flows through our city. My name's Nella Etkind and I'll be your host. You've just heard the sound of the Atlantic Ocean in Mully Point, not far from the V&A waterfront, where there's one of 3 desalination plants that have recently been set up by the city. The other 2 plants are in Strandfontein and Monwi, BC. Desalination, the process of turning salt water into fresh water using processes called reverse osmosis, is one of the ways the city is aiming to increase its water supply. While desalination is one water augmentation strategy that might seem like an obvious solution for Cape Town, given it's surrounded by an ocean, the desalination process should be approached with caution because it comes with a number of concerns. It's expensive compared to other alternatives. Each of the plants set up by the city cost around 250 million. It disturbs life in the ocean by changing salt levels and through mechanical processes. It poses health risks to humans because essential minerals normally found in fresh water are filtered out, and some health hazards found in polluted seawaters might be hard to detect and therefore difficult to treat. It also takes a lot of energy to run, especially in colder waters like those in Cape Town. And if that energy is powered by fossil fuels, it means we are adding to the impacts of climate change that are contributing to the drought in the first place. We've had some rain recently. Yay! Scientists say that rainfall in April is a good indicator for the amount of rain that will come for the rest of the year. Unfortunately, the rain we've had in April hasn't quite been enough. There's a 5% chance that our dams will take us through to the winter of 2019. While we can hope for more rain, what are some other ways we can source water?
We know that our water supply in the city is inadequate, so we need to have a new water supply. But on what principles would this new water supply be based on? We have to think about the big picture here. Who's going to benefit? Who's going to be the casualty of a new water supply? Is it going to be another quick fix solution that will come back in 20 years and bite us in the ass?
Those were the words of Nella Etkind, a farmer from the Philippi horticultural area, later interviewed in this episode to provide some food for thought as we dig a little bit deeper into the theme of augmentation. There are a number of water augmentation options. Desalination is one of them, but there's also groundwater extraction through borehole digging, constructing and or maintaining dams, wastewater recycling, and of course rainwater harvesting. In this episode, we speak to Thando Mchunu, a master's student in environmental humanities from the University of Cape Town, who offers a unique way of thinking about the future of dams in South Africa. We'll hear from Derek Whitfield, a geologist who, with his company EDRS, is currently digging 2 major boreholes for the city of Cape Town. We'll be introduced to the importance of responsible aquifer management when extracting groundwater from the Cape Flats aquifer from Nella Etkind, a farmer in the Philippi horticultural area, who also links water to food production and sovereignty. We'll learn about building a cost-effective ferro-cement tank for rainwater harvesting from natural builders Conway Lotter of Stop Reset Go and Carrie Pretorius of Hearth Earth Art. We'll meet Simbi Nkula, co-founder of the Black Filmmakers Film Festival, who will describe how his organization creates a platform for filmmakers of color while using the film as a catalyst for dialogue about important issues like healthy oceans. We go now to Thando Mchunu, a master's student in environmental humanities from the University of Cape Town, exploring the future of dams in South Africa. Her studies focus on the newest dam in the Western Cape, known as the Berg Rivier Dam.
I am focusing at the Borek River Dam, which is one of the brainchild behind Cape Town's solutions to the water crisis. There's a lot of information and good things which are being said about the dam, and I found that very fascinating given the history and the unfavorability around dams.
While the Berg Rivier Dam was completed fairly recently in 2009, there have been plans to build up this dam for around 100 years. When the dam is full, it can hold up to 130 billion litres of water, which is about 260 days of water in the city of Cape Town. This is much smaller than the main dam supplying the city with water, the Theewaterskloof Dam, but an important contribution nonetheless.
This particular dam has stood out in terms of it following all the appropriate guidelines and checking off all the checklists, but I was more interested in understanding the story behind it as opposed to what the dam is there for. I'm very much interested in looking at multiple perspectives from people who are engaging with the dam on a daily and what the dam means for them in the future. Most of the stories or narratives around the dams I encountered seemed to further support this idea that dams are not part of nature or are not in relation to human societies. They're not part of our everyday interactions, which makes it hard to then see ourselves in relation to dams.
While dams have the obvious benefit of supplying us with water, their costs are high, and not just in terms of money. The development of dams have been found to displace people, alter ecosystems, change climatic conditions of a region, and even cause earthquakes. With consideration for both the advantages and disadvantages of dams, Thando shares her unique approach of trying to see dams in a new way.
So you'd encounter works around pro-dams, you'd encounter works around anti-dams, and the work around the technopolitics around dams. But I didn't want to place myself within these distinct kind of fields, particularly because I found them very limiting in that they just look at the impacts of dam and they don't show the processes around the dam undergoing changes, or they don't speak about what makes up the dam. So the material conditions around the dam are more important questions to ask when you're trying to understand the life or the agency of dams. And I know it's hard for people to understand how dams can become agents, because we tend to look at these as just inanimate objects which are not living. They're just concrete rock and they don't come alive in some way. But what I'm trying to do with this particular project is, what are the stakes of having to study the material conditions of the Berg River Dam? What other ways of thinking or ideas around infrastructure can emanate from this kind of thinking? So the possibilities of dams.
One of the earliest dams in South Africa was the Gqweba Dam that was built on the Sundays River for irrigation and to meet other freshwater needs in the town of Graaff-Reinet. Thando helps us understand that ideas about dams have been closely linked to what was going on in the surrounding society at the time each dam was built.
Dams in South Africa come about in a very particular moment in history and at different political regimes. Dams served a particular purpose during colonial times, and they were solely for farmers. So dams were seen to be built to serve the purpose of agricultural production at large scales. With the coming of democracy and how there were many communities who did not have access to clean water and sanitation, the whole idea of dams being just for agriculture had to then change. So dams had to serve the people. Dams were a common good, and to some degree that is still the logic behind and why governments are seen as to be custodians of these resources. In more recent times, the expansion of more neoliberal ideas and policies in place makes it hard for them to consider dams as something which is public, because the water then becomes something that needs to be privatized or needs to be under a particular ownership by an individual or companies. At these political moments or regimes, dams and the idea behind dams shifts, and the ideas around water and what water means also become contested and challenged.
What about dams before colonization? The stories of this time period are often absent from mainstream history books. A deeper glance into the history of dams reveals how people have been working with water for centuries, but the ideas and practices around the ownership of water, and therefore presence or absence of dams, have changed.
The indigenous Khoi people, they too had a relation with the land and with water which was particular, and for them they did not view water bodies as something which can be owned by individuals. With more modern times, there's a much greater need to accumulate large amounts of water to supply a growing population. Now for me, I'm trying to understand why. If you think about the future of dams, we have to then question who owns the dams, what intentions, and does this have implications on the region's water?
Given this history, the various dam narratives, and the evolving ideas about water ownership, is there a future for dams in South Africa?
If we were to look how dams have been operating over the years, they have increasingly been deteriorating and breaking down, largely because a normal lifespan of a dam would be like 40, 50 years. And most of our dams in South Africa are reaching that end of their lifespan, which made me want to think about the future. Does that mean we shouldn't use dams anymore? Something we could think about is repurposing dams. And how might that look like? It would require very much creative minds, engineers, community members to re-envision that space.
Dams are one way that we capture and contain water that flows on the surface of the ground from sources like mountains, streams, and rivers. But like with most things, there's a lot we can learn from looking beneath the surface and exploring other options. One option is to look at accessing water that flows under the ground. A borehole is a way we can get water from under the ground. But how do we dig a borehole? Where do we dig a borehole? Can anyone dig a borehole? To find out more, we'll hear from Derek Whitfield.
My name's Derek Whitfield. I represent a company called EDRS. We're involved with the drilling of the aquifers in the Western Cape for the Western Cape government for large-scale bulk water abstraction for the city. We also do domestic holes when we have a chance, but the demand has been so high this year that we've only done work for industry and the Western Cape government. I studied geology at university and then specialized in groundwater. And then I consulted for 5 or 6 years and then decided to go contracting, getting my hands dirty rather than writing reports. It's in the Western Cape. There's shallow groundwater and there's deeper groundwater. The shallower water is usually accessed by something called a well point, which is relatively cheap to install, and it's only a matter of a couple of meters deep. A borehole taps into deeper aquifers and allows you to abstract a lot more water than a shallow well point. A borehole or a well point really is a conduit to the aquifer that allows you to abstract water that is residing in the aquifer below the surface. And there are different ways of drilling a borehole depending on the rock or the sand.
Wait, so let's get a bit of background on this whole groundwater thing. The aquifers, geology, and all that.
Groundwater comes from the sky. It gets recharged by means of rainfall and artificial means, where once you've treated water, you can reintroduce it back into the ground through seepage pits or soakaways, or directly through boreholes into the ground. But the natural method of recharge is by rainfall. You know, it's been raining in this part of the world for millions and millions of years, and that water has filled up all the cracks in the sand that's been lying here. And it's not static. It doesn't just fill up and then stand and wait around. It flows underground, albeit slowly, and in the order of a few meters a year. It would generally flow out towards the coast. And once it gets to the sea, you get undersea freshwater springs happening along the coast. So that water would then be lost to man, as it were. So if we can intercept that water, we can use it, and if you can use it in a sustainable way, then it's a sustainable resource. Hard rock aquifers like the Table Mountain group that we get in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape is literally that. It's hard rock that's been folded and broken and brecciated and fractured, and the water resides in those cracks and crevices below the ground. And when you drill a borehole, you try and target that the borehole intercepts those cracks, because they're the conduits in the ground and also where the storage happens.
It sounds like accessing groundwater responsibly is an important option to consider, especially if it can reduce the demand placed on the city's water supply. What do we need to think about if we're going to dig a borehole?
If you're looking at going off the grid by means of drilling a borehole, there are typically a couple of stages that you need to consider. Let's assume that you were lucky enough to get water, because there's no guarantee that if you drill a borehole, you're actually going to get water. Thankfully, most places in the Western Cape, that is the case. But upcountry, it is a hit and miss. It's a gamble. The driller can't guarantee you if there's water or the quality of water. The homework has to be done by the client, and you're best to go and visit your neighbours and find out if they've drilled a borehole and how deep and what issues they encountered, so that you can warn the contractor or you can be forearmed with what's coming your way. Once you've drilled a hole, you need to test it to quantify its sustainable yield. That's typically done by installing a pump and pumping water out to waste or onto a garden or a field, whatever there is. And you measure the water level in the hole as you're pumping, and after a certain amount of time you measure the recovery. And that allows you to quantify and get an image of what's happening under the ground. And sure, it can be a couple of million litres that goes down the wastewater, which will get caught up somewhere along the system and used again. But you need to do that to test and stress the aquifer to allow you to size what size pump you're going to put into that borehole. While we're testing, we take a sample and send it off to the laboratory to get a chemical analysis, because not all water is created equally. And that allows us to determine if any filtration or purification needs to be done. And then you specify the pump that goes in the hole based on your results of the testing, and you put in the plumbing system. Once you've got that borehole, you've got it for life if it's been done properly. Maintenance is really negligible. The pump works, if it's sized properly, it will work for 10, 15 years without you even looking at it. And then you've gone off the grid. You're on your own water supply.
Okay, so now that we have a better idea of how to dig a borehole, here's the burning question that's been on our minds. How much does it cost to dig a borehole?
The cost of making a hole is an expensive exercise, unfortunately. It really depends where you're going to drill the hole in terms of the geology. If it's a hard rock borehole or it's an alluvial aquifer borehole, you're looking anywhere between 50 and 150,000 rand for a borehole, and then you still got your pumping system. 120 to 180 is probably a more realistic figure.
Given the high cost of digging boreholes, what is the cost-benefit analysis of the city when it comes to boreholes as water augmentation strategy? In other words, is it worth it? Given Derek's warnings that water is not always a guarantee, has the location targeted for boreholes been carefully considered?
At the moment, the city's concentrated on the Cape Flats alluvial aquifer, which is a thick sediment package located between Table Mountain, Durbanville Hills and Somerset West. Millions of years ago, the sea level was considerably higher than it is now. So Table Mountain and the peninsula was an island off South Africa. And with the sea level being high, we had erosion of the land between Table Mountain, as we know today, and Somerset West in this broad valley. And with the receding of the water levels, it left a thick package of sand. We also had times where the sea level dropped to as much as 170 meters below current surface levels. And rivers coursed through this valley and gouged into the rock below, leaving areas of slightly deeper sediments that were later filled up with sediment, with sand. And those are the target zones where you get good water and lots of water out of them. There's also a similar aquifer up the west coast known as the Atlantis aquifer. Springfontein, Saferfontein and Atlantis. It's also an alluvial aquifer. The city is looking at abstracting about 55 million litres a day from the Cape Flats aquifer, and I think it's 15 or 20 million litres a day from the Atlantis, Strandfontein, Silver Sands aquifer. Once that's been treated, that would be an augmentation for the city's municipal.
Now that we know the financial cost of boreholes, what are other, maybe less visible costs in terms of the impacts on humans and non-humans in the long term?
The ecological impacts of boreholes have yet to be quantified and studied properly. The groundwater is a renewable resource. As long as we don't take out more than what gets recharged over a period of time, if we don't use it, it just ends up leaking out to sea. So we want to try and strike a balance between not depleting it and not underutilizing it, and making sure there's enough for the environment as well. A borehole is like a straw going into a glass. Put lots of straws in the glass and everyone has a little sip, you'll empty the glass quicker than you can fill it. So in times like this, we prefer to ask people not to use it for irrigation of their garden, but rather for household consumption, and take the pressure off the treated water from the city.
The National Water Act of 1998 declared groundwater a public good, but As we've seen, it's easier declared than done. Given how expensive boreholes are, they largely serve private middle-class households, sometimes maintaining the status quo of lawns and swimming pools, as the media has reported. While many boreholes have been dug, and this does provide some relief to the city water supply, we don't have a way to regulate borehole use. This falls in the jurisdiction of the national government. So it's not in the power of the city to regulate borehole use. How can we work towards a way of using groundwater that makes it truly available for the whole public? Let's visualize the image Derek described to us of a borehole being like a straw going into a glass and taking a sip. Who might the other straws in the same glass belong to? In the case of the glass being the Cape Flats aquifer, one straw links to an entire farming community that provides essential food to the city and that supports necessary ecological processes for recharging the aquifer. This community is known as the Philippi Horticultural Area, or PHA. We'll hear now from one of PHA's farmers and long-term activist in protecting the aquifer, Nazir Sonde.
I was born in the area. I was removed out of the area in 1973 through the Group Areas Act. And in 1991, I came back into the area and I bought some land. I bought a hectare here. I started farming in 2008. Between 2008 and 2013, we formed a number of organizations in the area. Before that, there was only the white farmers group in this area. And in 2013, we launched the PHA Food and Farming Campaign to protect the Philippi Horticulture Area and take part in all the public participation processes and advocacy around the PHA, but also to develop a small-scale farming model that we could be using for land reform in the area.
In the last 6 years, they've learned a lot about the Cape Flats aquifer, so much so that it's become an environmental feature central for their campaign.
We organized 2 aquifer seminars where we wanted to understand the aquifer better because we're drawing our water from there. So in 2013, we held the Cape Flats Aquifer Seminar, and then again in 2016, we come to understand that actually the aquifer is an amazing resource, not only for us as farmers, but also for the broader Cape Town area, that the aquifer could supply the city with about a third of its potable water needs, provided you manage the aquifer properly. It's better than a dam because you don't have evaporation. You have to manage the aquifer in a way that you secure recharge areas for the aquifer, where your rainwater can seep into the soil and recharge the aquifer, rainwater and stormwater. Our area has been performing that function, whereas most of the area above the aquifer has been paved over with urban developments, you see. So our area is very significant. It's the primary recharge zone for the aquifer. The aquifer will have to be managed, and that management will have to come about through local communities, all 3 tiers of government, and put a management plan in place for this aquifer. One of the big problems that we are seeing happening is that we are extracting from the aquifer, right? But we are not able to monitor what's happening in the aquifer. And we're very concerned that because we have this extended drought, or we are not recharging the aquifer, and at the same time, we're extracting more out of the aquifer. In the last year, according to WWF, 22,000 boreholes went into this aquifer. Historically, the aquifer gets recharged through rain, but also water flows from higher areas. So your Tygerberg Hills, your Helderberg Mountain Range, your Table Mountain Range, all the water flows from the mountains. They run on surface, but also below ground. And that feeds into the aquifer and recharges it. But now in a case where the city is expanding, population is growing, climate change is producing extreme weather, droughts and so on, your recharge is not sufficient, right? And so this poses an interesting question, is how do we then artificially recharge this aquifer?
As it turns out, we have an example of good aquifer management no more than 70 kilometers away from the city of Cape Town.
In Atlantis. There you have a system where since the 1980s, the wastewater from the houses, the industry, and the stormwater gets ponded together and it's clean in the reed beds. So then this clean water is then dumped into this recharge ponds and it sinks into the aquifer. So that system exists in the city already. It's just 20 minutes from here. And so we've been calling for such a system for a very long time because around our area we have 3 wastewater works.
So, what happens to the city's wastewater?
We are taking our wastewater, we're cleaning it up to agricultural use standards, but we're dumping it into the sea. We're using energy, we're using fresh water to clean that water and dump it into the sea. So we've been saying for a very, very long time that we can reverse the plumbing on these plants and get that water to come and pond in our area. Then we can be using it to recharge the aquifer, but at the same time we can also be using the water for irrigation because it's quite safe for irrigation. So this is where we see how this aquifer can be recharged artificially. The scientists call it managed aquifer recharge. But in that management plan would not only be wastewater, but also our stormwater. So when it does rain, you hold your stormwater in the landscape as far as possible before overflowing into the sea. This area has been performing that stormwater function historically because when a storm's here, the water flows to those areas through sewage system that the farmers have developed over 100 years.
Just like he's pointed to the impacts we create through the choices we make when it comes to whether or not we pave over land and what we do with our wastewater, Nazir reminds us how the same can be said of our choices around making and eating food.
What we have a huge problem with is food security. So while we're producing all these export quality commodities, we are starving in the city. And in a drought, you have even less water available for food production, real food production, not agricultural commodities, but the real food like horticulture, carrots, cabbage, cauliflower, sheep, goats, that's real food production. There's hardly any land left for this kind of production, nor is there water left for this. But we are exporting all our commodities. In this time of drought, we have to assess, do we need to have so many wine farms? We have to make that decision because not only is it an environmental issue, but it's also a social issue because those farms only have seasonal workers. But if you replace half of those farms with food-producing horticultural farming, then you will have a lot more workers permanently employed and you'll be producing a whole lot more horticulture for the city. So we can be producing a lot more of that locally, bringing the price of food down and making everybody able to afford food. And the drought kind of puts it out there to say, you know what, we haven't thought about it in this way, and we should, actually.
The Philippi Horticultural Area's Food and Farming Campaign would love more students, schools, researchers, and individuals to get involved in environmental education through agriculture and to come out and show support to the various events. You can find out more at their Facebook page at www.facebook.com/PHA Food Farming Campaign /. We come away from our meeting with Nazir with some practical suggestions of how to access, manage, and utilize our water in a spirit of solidarity and reciprocity, quite literally from the ground up. Building on this, and now entering what has previously been known as a rainy season, we meet 2 natural builders. Conway Lotter from Stop Reset Go and Kerry Pretorius from Hearth Earth Art teach us how building our own cost-effective ferrous cement tank for rainwater harvesting can be a great opportunity for building a community too.
My name's Carrie Pretorius. Ferrocement it's basically just another option to storing water, catching water, harvesting water, and creating water batteries. It's all about alternatives, and myself and Conway are very exciting now to collaborate and actually channel where ferrocement water tanks would most be beneficial.
Hi, my name is Conway Lotter. I'm from Welcome Glen, which is in the Southern Peninsula. I think we're all starting to understand in our communities that we have real connection to not just our landscapes but to each other. A few of us from Stop Reset Go actually went to this community that we had a relationship, which is the Solomon Square Rastafarian Camp above Ocean View. And we entered into the discussion. It actually started with the community garden first, and that developed into indigenous gardens. We put all the mulch in the beds and we had to wait for them to plant when it rains. So the next phase was to build a water tank. I started doing a bit of research, and ferrocement came up. The UN uses them in rural areas. So I started doing some research on how to build them. And when I spoke to a couple of people, they said, Connor, they're amazing, but unless you do the work yourself, they become quite expensive. there was a side of me that was almost a little bit like, oh no, but then I suddenly went, wow, this is almost like it's an opportunity, because it becomes really empowering, because so you can literally, with your neighbours, with the community, with anyone, you can literally start to build them yourself. So we started building one with them. So that's been our pilot project.
I was lucky enough to be involved in the building of a ferrocement tank about 3 years ago. I think it was 10 of us. We built a 25,000 litre volume ferrocement tank in 5 days. When you build a ferrocement tank, you have to take into consideration your water source. Is it going to be from a borehole water? Is it going to be rainwater catchment? Are you harvesting from a spring? For example, the Ocean View project. Once you've worked out how big you want your tank, you prepare your ground zero. You construct a base of your wire mesh or rebar. On the base, you throw a concrete floor, and then you make means for connections to your base by putting some little vertical rods up, and then that's what your main framework is going to be attached to. For the main framework, you take a wire welded mesh and you attach chicken wire to both the inside and the outside using binding wires. Then it's simply a matter of mixing your cement and your sand. And someone stands on the other side of your framework, holds a hand hook, which is one of those square plastic boards you can make your own using a plyboard, and you take the cement and you trowel it into the walls, really pushing into, so you're filling all the holes. You do the one side complete, and then you do it from the inside out. You have to be very careful that you completely cover your metal framework. If you don't, that could be exposed and cause rust. You also can add extra waterproofing, either by making just a very runny cement slurry and painting it on with a spatkwas, which are those brushes, or you can add various waterproofing powdered products to your cement slurry, and then that is painted on, and that's pretty much it. So once you've completed, there is a system of plumbing involved, and so, once you've worked out that, then it's a question of getting human resources, volunteers or communities, travellers who are willing to donate their time within communities, because they think it's a great way to actually integrate within communities who are undergoing real issues. It's got a lot of potential.
You empower communities quite quickly into building their own. It's been a reminder lesson to me just all along the way about, first of all, engaging people in that process, allowing them to contribute, and to share, and not to take too much ownership of it. The Real House is really good at this, when they say we're not teachers in the sense we just hold space for you to allow for you to empower yourself, step forward and to just take ownership of this project, whatever it is. To actually start to remember that you actually have the skills, this innate wisdom that's in us. Wow, well in the word well-being. So because we're water containers ourselves, in a sense.
Humans as water containers. Plants and animals as water containers, ferrocement tanks, dams, desalination and wastewater treatment plants, aquifers, glasses, mugs, thermos flasks, teacups, ceramic pots, all water containers. Water, the ultimate shapeshifter, taking on the form of whichever container it finds as its home at the time, with all roads beginning and ending in convergence with the sea. Shaping and shifting in the art world, the Cape Town-based Black Filmmakers Film Festival, or BFFF, is a movement of black filmmakers sharing and supporting each other's work through workshops and events. Next, Simbi Nkula, co-founder of the BFFF, describes how his organization uses film as a catalyst for inclusive dialogue about important issues.
The idea of Black Filmmakers Film Festival, it raised up through frustration and through undermining of black films and the way of black film making. I'm a filmmaker myself, and I just see that there were a lot of potential films made by black filmmakers and also learn more in the whole continent itself, but there is no space which they can showcase their films. So I thought that it was a good initiative that I can offer the space where people can enjoy film made by people of color. By black women, each person who been called like under apartheid regime, which include Indian, Chinese, colored, and black. The goals of Black Filmmakers Film Festival is to promote films made by people of color across the continent and the global through this series of events and workshops and film screenings. Like we do now, it's more like celebrating films made by people of color and create films, which we more like an educational part of it. So skills development and workshops, talks, and panel discussions. Right now, it's doing films at the Alliance Française every last Wednesday of the month, and in P every first Thursday, and in Borek as well every first Thursday, and in Durban every last Friday. So this is our model where our event works. So we do sort of like music performance and poetry and or performance before the film screenings, and after we screen films, we finish with a discussion of a Q&A or any genre of discussion. It depends on the theme of the month which we have.
On Friday, 4th May, Zuid-Moka, or Museum of Contemporary Art of Africa in Cape Town, hosted for the first time ever a screening and dialogue event in partnership with the BFFF. One of the films shown during that event was a short fantasy called Jonah, directed in 2013 by Kibwe Tavares. In the film, Mbwana and his best friend Juma are two young men with big dreams. These dreams become a reality when they photograph a giant fish leaping out of the sea, and their small town blossoms into a tourist hotspot as a result. But for Mbwana, the reality isn't what he dreamed. And when he meets the fish again, both of them forgotten, ruined, and old, he decides only one of them can survive.
The Jonas films. The film is based in Tanzania, and then it's a powerful film. Take on how we see the advantage of tourism and disadvantage of tourism, but it's focused more on the disadvantage of tourism and how globalization is all about, and the environment itself, how people keep the natural resources separated to the damage which we cause to our countries. He promoted that city through that fish, and everyone came because they were like, this is the biggest fish you have in the world. And then he sucked tourists in, and then at the end when you see the damage you've done, then that's why you were like at the end, say, okay, it's either you leave or I leave, because this is what's going to happen to us. We created this. I love the cinematographer. I love the story itself, how he split it in a very short time, and he managed to bring the conclusion and very clearly enough that you can understand that this is all about the environment. It's all about water preservation.
We asked Simbi what kind of story he might tell if he were going to make a film about Cape Town's water situation.
I was just going to tell the story about how is life being in the location as a black person. Because saving water, that's what they've been doing for years. Is saving water every day. Because you go and get at the common, you have a bucket, you need to wash, so you need to save because you don't want to go back there and go and fetch because it's quite a bit distance. So you can't just do that. You have outside toilets, so you know that thing. This issue as a filmmaker, if I had the opportunity to share something, I would say that with middle class or first class Kempsville Constantia life, which there's a big swimming pool with one person staying in the 200 square meters and all that, I'm just going to allow them to pay a visit to the location. Then that's the only way they can save water. Because just to do exactly as they do. The whole process, it's an education for water saving in each family in the location.
Simbi's passion for film as a tool to foster inclusiveness and to help raise awareness of critical issues came across in high definition.
The influence what's create motion pictures, it just allow everyone to be part of it, everyone to feel like it's not excluded, because literature, the creation of it is a king's house. Someone came and teach the king's family. It was very expensive, very not inclusive. At the same time, it's limited with the poor countries without education. That's why I think that filmmaking is just the best way to reach up to anyone, even to educate a person so fast than you can imagine.
For more information about the Black Filmmakers Film Festival, check out their website www.blackfff.co.za. While the movie Jonah showed the harm that tourism can sometimes bring to the ocean, what damage might desalination plants bring to both ocean and tourism? As we stand at the edge of the crashing sea surf to reflect on one water augmentation strategy, let's remember that supply is only one side of the water story. Professor Neil Armitage, a civil engineer at UCT, said that reducing demand for water massively reduces the scale of augmentation required. With evidence that our city is currently consuming water in a way that is unsustainable and unequal, are we talking about sourcing more water for business as usual? Or is it sourcing more water and radically changing our relationship with water? We'd love to augment the input on this podcast by hearing your thoughts. To send in your questions, suggestions, and for more information, please go to www.dayonewater.wordpress.com.